All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be at this time of day. Hopefully you are all doing well. We'll go ahead and begin the show. This is strange. I'm not used to this, so okay. Bear with me. I'm doing the Early Start Denver model, a naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention. It's a lot of fun to spit that out. I am Wyatt Smart. I am recording this for our Sped 5490 literature review presentation. I hope you enjoy. I will say, Early Start Denver model, I had no idea what it was or where it came from. It came up upon some literature stuff that I was reading through, and it got my attention, obviously. I'm from Denver. Thought it would be fun. Looked into it. It's quite an interesting model, and it brings up a lot of great talking points, which we'll get towards the end. Let's get into the agenda now. So I will say, first off, I'd like to review what naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention is, just very briefly. Also, we'll talk about the history of Early Start Denver model, ESDM, if you will. We'll get into the core ideas and goals of ESDM in a nutshell as far as the program goes, and then the research that went into ESDM, at least a couple things. I think there's a lot of research, but just covered a few things that I thought was helpful in this piece. We'll get into the literature review of a study that I picked out that I thought had some interesting points that are both worth some debate and also worth some future implications. And then we'll talk about the implications of professional practice, not only from this study, but also just ESDM and just a future work. Okay. The Early Start Denver model comes from the umbrella genre of a naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention. NDBI came from the early days of just naturalistic behavioral interventions, but researchers who were more so inside of the favored developmental perspective, people that took on naturalistic behavior, which is important for generalizing and all of that, also wanted to bring in that developmental perspective. I think we can see that in PRT, which we've gone through before, the pivotal response training in our classes, but also, a lot of the enhanced milieu training and Jasper, or the joint attention symbolic play engagement and regulation, came out of that idea of the developmental aspect of the naturalistic behavioral intervention. So again, that kind of became its own little thing, which, to be honest, just delving into that just kind of opened up a lot of understandings of how we look at the different naturalistic approaches that even though it can be student-led and more loosely trained, it can also still be very developmentally sequenced and, strategic, which that's kind of where the Early Start Denver model came to, was using a lot of that idea of being able to position. I got all of this, by the way, from Odum's wonderful article that kind of turned me on to a lot of different interventions, actually, but that's where I picked out the Denver model, the Early Start Denver model, which came out of this article reading about a 40-year perspective of DSM-3, but how it introduced lots of interventions that came out from the identification of autism and that kind of spin-off of like how it evolved from, very tight ABA style DTT to opening it up into more inclusionary practices, which involves, definitely using more naturalistic approaches, training inside of the context. Okay. Well, so let's keep going. Um, Models directed at the classroom context was important, and the early Street Denver model was directed towards classroom interventions. Although I will say the research that I looked at not always was about being in a preschool, it was about being inside of the routines and things like that. And I think that also goes to show us some of the problems I had with the research that I did that I'll get into later. I'm not going to get onto any tangents yet. Okay. ESDM, the early beginnings and how it came to be. The Denver model came from as early as 1981 when Dr. Sally Rogers developed ideas around teaching preschoolers with autism while working at the University of Colorado Medical Center. Their early model was groundbreaking in that it followed a developmental model to teach children. Again, this is before the idea of the naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention thing came out in 2015. The idea that they were looking at development in early preschoolers with kids with autism early on. And I think they were really looking at how normal kids, or excuse me, I should say typical kids, developed through and how they eventually kind of caught up, or like how they could see how kids with autism were not meeting some of those milestones, which certainly played a huge piece in the development of their opus, if you will. And I say they because Dr. Rogers came along with Dr. Geraldine Dawson to create and publish a developmental framework for the early start Denver model in 2010. The developmental framework considers the exploratory nature of infants and young children and applied behavior analysis to teach skills to very young children with autism spectrum disorder. The scientific background, conceptual framework, and reliance on transdisciplinary team efforts and ESDM to promote best outcomes for young children with ASD from birth through 48 months of age are described. And that was registered in 2016. Excellent chapter, excellent chapter in the comprehensive models of autism spectrum disorder treatment, points of divergence and convergence. I have to say that that chapter in that paper, that collection of essays, was really cool. I really got to I looked into a few different ones, but I stick with early start Denver model. But man, it was cool to see the different things that came out of it. So, but it was a great way to get a framework and what the intentions were behind it. And in fact, I'm going to cover that here really soon, especially the core ideas and the goals. But ESDM, the Denver model, came out, and now it's nationally, internationally recognized. I have, in fact, the study that I'm going to really focus on is out of New Zealand, but I also had a meta-analysis with people that did some with around Asian children in Asian countries and how well they took to that model. So not just a Denver thing, it turns out. Okay, so let's look at early start Denver model ideas and goals. So let's start with the core ideas. Number one, communication begins before speech. Communication is based in understanding other people, understanding that other people have minds and intentions. This can be demonstrated through joint attention, imitation, and sharing language. The idea really is that it comes from, that communication is happening immediately from 8 months on, and that even before that, but dominantly 8 to 12 months is when that communication is starting to really develop, and they're watching and trying to mimic and things like that. And we notice that by 12 months, if they're not attaining or matching with what we're doing or sharing, we see that something's up, and it puts up some flags. And so knowing that that's a really important part of their life, and that they're probably starting to already miss out on that, students with autism, that is, and knowing that that's something we might need to begin therapy or intervention soon. Number two, the quality of a child's relationship with a teacher or peer affects a child's learning from that teacher and peer. So relationship means a lot. This leads to student-led interventions, taking turns, and positive feedback. More to that, of course. Like, a relationship is based on trust and all of that, and certainly not based on just making demands on a student and expecting them to get it for like a little tiny reward that doesn't necessarily match their idea. And we're going to talk about some of the goals that might come from that, but an interesting idea that the child's relationship, and this also leads towards student-led interventions, because by a child leading, they have a say in the relationship. Idea number 3, social interactions and the reinforcement is a natural impairment for children with autism. Thus, providing purposeful time and support to reinforce positive social interaction is incredibly important. I think the key takeaway here is that they're recognizing that this is a deficit that is part of autism. It's not something that naturally occurs where they're looking to connect with a peer. They do not get that same reinforcement, students with autism. And so they're looking at, so the idea that they're not naturally drawn to the reinforcement of having engagement with other people might lead to why they're not making that happen. I know that's one of 3 theories around why, autism affects some of the social connections and things like that. But certainly in this theory, we are looking at that as a primary piece, the impairment or not getting any kind of real engagement from social interaction. Okay, so that leads us to our goals from ESDM, and these are all written out by Dr. Rogers in her 2016 chapter in the collection of different essays, but also it built off of her 2010 developmental framework that she published. Her and oh gosh, now I can't remember the doctor's name, but certainly from previous teachings, or from her 2010 paper, and the fact that it kind of connects those core ideas. Number 1, to bring back children into social interaction. Knowing most children are developing social habits all their waking day. They made that very explicit. You're waking, as soon as you're up, you're imitating, or you're looking at something and wondering what the next thing to do is, and all of that as you're a baby or a toddler. And then students with autism are missing some of those waking day imitations or models of how to do it because they're not engaging. And so with that idea, how do you make up for that time that's been lost? Right. So at least engaging them so that kind of brings us to having lots and lots of time with intervention and social, imitation or engagement in some way. Number 2, teaching children early social skills. These include imitation, joint attention, play and pretend play, and language and nonverbal communication. This comes to those keystone kind of elements of what helps us with communicating and creating a social connection with people. So, the idea of being able to imitate so that you can learn how to do things. Joint attention so that you can begin to communicate, play and pretend play so that you can have more social interactions with kids your age, and language and nonverbal communication for obvious reasons, to get what you need, demand, right? And intensive support and teaching will help fill in the gaps and keep children from losing more attention is number 3. So the idea that in the end, all of this comes down to intensive intervention, right? Early on to make up for any possible losses. All right. So I'll try not to, this is a tricky one because it's a large program, and it's not technically scripted, but very drawn out, and certainly created to be very specific in how you run the program. So it is like I said, they developed a full-on handbook on this, which is retrievable. It's the 2010 document, referenced in the 2016 paper that I'm referencing right now. But incredibly informational, this paper, but also going back to the handbook would be important. ESDM program in a nutshell. Let's go ahead and go. It starts out with goals. Goals are set using the ESDM curriculum checklist, which is used during observed playtime and interactions. In the study that I'm going to do, they have a therapist that plays with the student or does kind of a 1 hour, kind of looking to see if there's imitation and things like that. And there's another therapist just going through the checklist, like finding what they're doing, what goals they're hitting, and what they're lagging in. The child is assessed every 12 weeks in this program. When they are assessed, that means they completely redo the treatment every time they assess. So, every 12 weeks is a new treatment plan. But in that 12 weeks, there's a lot going on too. The assessment determines what is focused on for the treatment and how many hours are recommended. So it might be a very intensive, if they're lagging or they have deficit and very, very basic skills, that's going to take more time, obviously. And going back to our core ideas, understanding that having those waking hours missing means we have to get in there. A treatment plan is set around objectives and goals to be accomplished across setting within 12 weeks. There may be 12 to 25 goals across the 9 domains, 9 developmental domains. The goals include creating a setting, an antecedent, target behavior is defined, and the criterion are a part of a goal. And again, there might be 12 goals. The steps are created for each goal. There are 5 steps, and I think it's important, and I'm not sure if I put this in there somewhere, but the idea is that when you're doing a treatment, or when you're doing when you're teaching to or having a session, you're not hitting just one goal. You might be hitting many of the goals all in one, and you're collecting data on that, and we'll take a look at it. But you're collecting data the whole time. So steps are created for each goal. There are 5 steps. The program starts with step 1, where the child starts at their established ability or mastery level. So if they're barely able to vocalize anything, you're looking at even making some kind of sound. Maybe that's where they're at with maybe they're able to do an utterance, and you're kind of rewarding on that level. And then you're looking at creating a much more of a vocalized sound. So this allows for a stress-free session by starting out that low level, and allows for reinforcement to begin immediately. Each step becomes more independent with less prompts and builds off success from last mastery. So that's where we start seeing the shaping happening. But it's also consistent that we're looking for more frequency to be happening, and also more not only more frequency, but also more accuracy when we're starting to shape, and then we go up to that next higher level. Major progress within a step is expected per week, is what it's stated. It may take more than 1 week for a step. Data is collected for each objective in a setting. Interval data for every 15 minutes on any objective taught. So interval data is interesting because, for the study that I'm going to delve into a little more later, that really took a 10-second piece, which is pretty significant. Teaching happens inside joint activity routines and all varieties of activities in different settings. Activities need to be based on student interests. In the study that I do, they only do it at their houses, but they switch around different rooms in the house where they play, or they're more interactive, or they have more reinforcement available, much like a PRT model. ESDM and research. So I'm just going to fly through this because I don't want to get too bogged into it. A meta-analysis was done in 2021 by Wang Luo, Tian, and Shen. ESDM showed significantly improved autism symptoms, language, and cognition. This was in 2021, but they looked at 11 high quality randomized controlled trial studies to come up with that result. I don't know what all of the, this was developed in 2010. So for the 11 years that were out there, the high quality randomized control trials showed significantly improved autism symptoms, language, and cognition. A study done by Vivani et al. In 2014, measuring the efficacy of the Early Start Denver delivered in a one-to-one fashion. That's a high intensity, definitely much more intensive, with probably hours ranging from 15 to 25 hours a week over a year, compared to 30 peers with ASD and different intervention program participating daily and day-long sessions both showed success. However, the ESDM group showed significantly higher gains in developmental rate and receptive language. So, basically interventions help, right? No matter what. The ESDM seemed to put a little bit of extra growth inside of the developmental rate in this one. Also, Halsinger and all provided an ESDM intervention to 7 boys, while 6 others were provided other interventions. Parents that were involved in the ESDM intervention found it highly acceptable, meaning that parents really liked how it was functioning. It was found to be compatible within daily preschool routines as well as at-home routines. The SDM group showed a trend toward improved receptive language and reduction in parent-reported core autism symptoms. No such improvement was noted in the control group. An important idea that ESDM, with its structure and its high intensity and targeted goals, certainly did more for the students. And those came from the references below, which we will also have available at the end of this presentation. Okay, ESDM through less intensive therapy, a deeper dive into a study. So in this one, we have a single subject design study, evaluation of a low intensity version of the Early Start Denver model with 4 preschool age boys with autism spectrum disorder. This was out of the International Journal of Developmental Disabilities. I found it while going through the Auraria Library, but also by studying through a lot of references through some of the articles that I had mentioned before. I like this one because it was a single subject design study, which I kind of wanted to get into because I found a lot of larger studies that were more a wider spread of students, and not so much on the intervention itself, but more in like how the effect was. This one still does, but it was interesting to see how they worked it to the study. That was Waddington, Vandermeer, Ogilvie, all from, or Sigafus as well, all from New Zealand. So Denver pushing its style on New Zealand. Pretty fun, huh? All right, a breakdown of the study. It was an experimental design, a single subject study using a non-concurrent multiple probe across participants' design. That's great that I see that there's already a big mess up. It's oh well. We have a setting. New Zealand, of course. Therapist was doing the ASDM intervention at the home of the children. Parts of the house were different depending on where the child was most comfortable or played more at. Mothers were providing a generalized phase after the therapist-based intervention phase. I will say this as well. Part of the desire to do it at home was understanding that therapies and clinics are incredibly expensive. Sometimes it's harder for parents to get to the clinics. It's harder for them to make that work. So they're looking at this like low intensity intervention as a more viable approach to working with students with autism. For a lot of different people, the understanding is that, we all want to have the most intensive, most effective intervention, but sometimes life doesn't allow us to have everything like that. Having 3 hours per week in the independent variable of therapist-guided Early Start Denver model intervention over a 3-week period, focusing on imitation, communication, engagement was the independent variable. And that is also to kind of display how much can you get done in a less intense environment. And 3 hours per week is by all means much less intensive, especially from the 15 to 25 hours a week kind of stuff that we were seeing in previous research. Dependent variables 4 were defined: imitation, functional utterance, intentional vocalization, and engagement. Videotape was gathered and data was based on 10-second intervals. Partial intervals, 10-second recording was used on imitation, utterance, and intentional vocalization. Whole interval, 10 seconds, was used for engagement. That was because that engagement could last for much longer bits, whereas utterances and things like that was more like if we could find it, any kind of moment in there, it was important. But you'll see the results as they come out, how they were quite important to kind of see and how it developed. But each one was defined well. The functional the functional viability of this was obviously to support students in these areas. Very important, as the SDM and the core ideas and goals demonstrated how important it is that we have these kind of interventions. Also, the idea of using less intensive therapy showed also kind of like how it sometimes is more functional to not have the most intensive thing for people that can't make that happen. Okay, here comes the breakdown of the study. On top of that, we talked about the participants, 4 boys with autism as well as their families. Each child was 4 and under. No child had a secondary medical or neurological condition. And then also no child was receiving supplementary specialized interventions. Each child was diagnosed by an independent disciplinary team with autism using the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, second edition, so the ADOS. But further, they were given the Vineland 2 and the Social Communication Questionnaire to better understand the child's functioning, which leads to some questions of like how much were they struggling, especially in language, but it was interesting to see what the results were, what the baseline showed, and how they improved. So, okay. These were all parts that wouldn't get them. Here's a breakdown really quickly of kind of what the Vineland showed, as well as the SEQ. Obviously impacted. I found it interesting that they had a risk of ASD, risk of ASD. I'm not as aware of the SEQ's ratings and the significance of it, but certainly there's some impact across communication, more in others. Chris certainly seemed to have huge issues, and then certainly the maladaptive index for behavior. Alan didn't seem to have as much issues, but certainly the others did, with Jivan being a higher. Okay. Intervention procedures. So they did a baseline. Therapists used little verbal prompting, but did provide utterances or vocalizations to imitate. Basically, they set up the stage, to like allow the student to try to do some imitating, engaging, vocalizing, but no prompting, no trying to get them to do it. It was, if they do it, they do it. Intervention was based on, during the first intervention session, was really trying to use the curriculum checklist, the SDM curriculum checklist that we talked about. They used a second therapist to kind of go through that. The checklist and parent interview spurred a setup of goals. They only looked at 2 to 3 goals, and they across the 9 domains. So they didn't follow that ESDM aspect specifically. They really looked at just 2 to 3 goals instead of like 12 to 25, which would have been a much more intensive need. But you got to cut somewhere, right, if you're going to do less intensity. The therapist then provided the therapy according to the SDM manual. Sessions lasted for an hour. Remember, we talked about 3 hours a week. Post-intervention generalization followed 1 week after the final intervention probe. These were conducted by the mothers. Follow-up was conducted 4 weeks after that. So they basically had 3 weeks with the mothers, and then they did a check to see how much it stuck. again, and this is, I want to just get into this really quickly. This might be, I don't know if I wrote this down, but that is one of the maybe somewhat of a problem with this, was that the mothers did not have a huge amount of training in this, and they didn't talk too much towards that in the study. But here are the results. You can see that imitation, and it looks like something happened to my thing, but this first box on the left, that's imitation. The imitation didn't rise considerably. It did rise. If you look at the baseline for Chris, it certainly, went up, and it stayed up after in the follow-up phase. The follow-up phase tended to be higher. Alan was a little bit rough, and then Javon wasn't super high, but still, given that it was low intensity, that's a pretty good show. We look at the baseline in the middle one we're looking at right now is the vocalization piece, and we look at a much bigger growth, especially in utterance, or vocal. Alan had more vocalization with the therapist, but did not do as much vocalization generalized until a little bit later, but that's kind of a weird path there. And then we look down at Chris, who had a major gain, huge, as did Jivan. So excellent results in that area. We do have a baselines in engagement. So all baselines were incredibly low. So any growth is great, and certainly engagement increased and stayed up. Although Alan's it seemed a little bit like less stable. All right. So the limitations that were brought up, as I kind of mentioned before, not as much therapy was provided by the parents, and the generalization was limited just to providers, but not inclusive to different environments. Further, studies should and could look at extending to school and home, but even to different areas of their like maybe like at the doctor's, I don't know, but they could extend beyond just goes from therapist to mom or therapist to sibling inside of the same room. Again, lower intensity, probably not going to see that, but you would wonder if you had a little bit higher intensity or a longer duration, how much more it would have made a difference. Not as much therapy provided by parent. The parents really did little. So even though they took over, they did not show much generalized effort between subjects. However, and that's probably why we saw some in the previous slides, kind of like that bit of a drop every once in a while. It probably was harder to maintain. The parents, certainly a larger diversity of subjects would also be helpful. I think they mentioned this in the article that, or in the study, that this was 4 kids in New Zealand, and they fit a specific type of student, and so they worked with those 4, but there are certainly a huge variety of different kids that could use different supports, and it would have been interesting if they could have added more goals as well, and kind of specify different types of growth and different types of interventions. So implications for professional practice. How will this intervention impact my practice? When reviewing the literature around ESDM and the core ideas and goals, I think it's important to remember how necessary early intervention is and why. Also understanding that social skills are more powerful and necessary than many people think. The fact that students with autism who do not receive reinforcement naturally for interacting need that extra time and purposeful support is better to follow a program with fidelity. Having a scripted program may not be the answer for every kid, but understanding the development of a child, knowing keystone skills that build upon other skills is so necessary. I'd also like to state that the idea that it's a low intervention study, that you can still get a lot accomplished even in a low intensity. So if you can figure out a way to try to get students that higher intensity and in different parts of their day, such as school. I mean, think about doubling up and hitting so many different goals in a day. If you're having a session at home and a session in the school, I mean, you're going to be hitting so much more. So, being able to be smart with your time as well, and using these very structured and targeted systems can be great for that. Um, Such as the ESDM, which is very goal specific and very targeted towards that kid's needs, based on those developmental domains. The implications for professional practice. What future effect will this have on your practice? Because I don't work with early intervention. However, every time I do read through these, I can't help but think, um, how can this be interpreted towards older kids? And I know that developmentally it's just completely different, obviously, but like, can we think about having more things like this? Understanding students have deficits are also a big deal. Knowing that older students still struggle with social connections and important communication skills, and they have seen more aversion around their deficits than reinforcement for the skills they do have. They're continuously impacted by social punishment and not given the extended, planned, and relationship-based teaching that is so important for our little ones. So basically, they still face an uphill battle, many of these kids that don't have autism, but do struggle in certain deficits. What would I do differently? You know, I'd like to continue to seek out more research extends. Again, this comes back to a little bit of what I was starting to get into, and I think it just jumped the gun a little bit. But the idea that we use developmental milestones for younger kids, but we don't look at how they're developmentally appropriate in certain other settings for older kids. And having that idea is really important when thinking about the ESDM structure and the developmental, behavioral, and sequential targets all kids have at every age. How can I start thinking about implementing a program that takes on their needs in a more logical and developmentally appropriate manner, with appropriate benchmarks to create goals towards that? I guess my big thing is, like, we create goals for academic needs, but we don't always create goals that are really developmentally appropriate for students and we don't really know what they're lagging specifically, and we just know that they're failing in certain areas. How can we make it go better, right? Whew. And sorry I had to rush through so much of that. But understanding that, I can certainly talk to more of it. I'm trying to get it all in that 20 minutes. The model that I chose was kind of like teach to the SDM and then really explore another article. With that understanding, there's a lot to break apart in the ESDM, and I really learned a significant amount. And I really enjoyed it. But here are the references that I used. And I will be providing the other documents or the other article that we studied, or that I kind of went over a little more in depth with you. Okay, thank you.